Hi everyone, so this is your short lecture video on the ontological arguments for the existence of God. Okay. Before I talk about this argument, I just want to say that this argument, when we talk about it, it's gonna sound a little strange, and you might think that it's not a serious argument in some kinds of ways. But I want to say at the get-go that if you think an argument is bad, then you either need to find a premise that is problematic. If it's a deductive argument, you need to figure out whether it's valid or invalid, and if it's invalid, then it's a bad argument. If it's valid, then you need to make sure it's not sound, or in other words, find a problem with the premises again. Or if it's not deductive, maybe it's inductive. You might try to find a problem with the conclusion. Again, you might try to find a problem with the premises. The whole point is just that if you think an argument's bad, you need to figure out where it goes bad, okay? And the ontological argument is a kind of argument that, I'll just say, it's kind of hard to figure out where it goes wrong. Okay, we'll look at some objections, but it's gonna sound really weird, and it's gonna sound like it's kind of cheating in some kinds of ways. But where it goes wrong and how it goes wrong is sometimes kind of difficult to pinpoint for lots of people, okay? So I just want to say that beforehand, because it might feel really easy just to dismiss and think, oh, whatever, like, this can't be a serious argument. If it's not serious, then you need to figure out where it goes wrong, okay? And maybe you can't, and then maybe you're actually stuck thinking that's actually a good argument, all right? Which might not be a bad thing, but anyway. Okay, so here is the ontological argument for the existence of God. All right, so the first premise is that God is an all-perfect being, all right? Now, this premise just comes from our working definition of God. It's omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient. All right, it's the characteristics of a perfect being. All right, so that seems right. We're just kind of assuming that. All right. Premise 2 says, suppose the greatest possible being exists only in the mind. Okay, what's this mean? Okay, this premise is saying, well, we can conceive of a perfect being, right? We can imagine a perfect being, right? When I talk about an omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent being, or God, you can imagine that, all right? You're not like totally lost on what I could possibly even mean. You know what I'm talking about. You know I'm talking about God, okay? This perfect being. All right, so suppose that that being, the greatest possible being that could ever possibly exist, only exists in our mind. Another way of putting it, suppose it's just part of our imagination or a concept, but it doesn't exist outside of that. Okay? So this is just saying, just pretend that God only exists in our mind and God doesn't exist out in reality. Okay? And what's going to happen is, once we assume that, we're going to look at some premises that try to show that that premise can't possibly work out, and that you actually need to conclude the opposite. And what the opposite is, we'll see momentarily. Okay, so. All right, so now you have in your mind God. And we're just pretending that God only exists in our mind right now, and not actually in reality. Okay. Maybe he does, but just pretend. Okay. All right, so if this premise is the case, premise 2, then there's a much greater conceivable being, because a being is greater if it exists. Okay, so again, let's take this a little slowly here, because it's also complicated. Okay, so you have in your mind, you're supposing that the greatest possible being, God, only is in your imagination. It's only in your understanding, it's only in your mind. Okay. This is saying, well, wait a second, there's a problem with that, because there's a much greater conceivable being than the one you're thinking of, because a being is greater if it exists. Okay? Or another way of thinking of it is, like, imagine God only as a concept in our mind. Now imagine if God actually existed and was also a concept in our mind, right? So we have a concept of this thing that actually exists, right? So we have it all the time, right? I have a concept of a computer, computers actually exists, okay? What thing is greater? God that actually exists, or God just in our mind? Well, it seems like something is way better if it actually exists than if it doesn't actually exist and it's just a thing in our mind, okay? Another way of thinking of this is existence. You might think it's necessary that if you have a perfect being that they exist, because if they didn't exist, then it couldn't be perfect, right? It seems like that's like a flaw. right? If you don't exist, it seems like a flawed sort of thing that you're dealing with. And then if it did exist, it would be a greater and better being, all right? Just like how, like, sure, we could conceive of unicorns, right? But think about if unicorns were actually real, right? You might think, well, if the unicorns were actually real, those would be greater beings, you might think, than just like the imaginary things in our head, because they actually exist, okay? I don't mean like greater, like practically greater. I mean like literally, it's just they're better beings, okay, than the things just in our head. Just like with God, right? It seems like if something's all perfect, like imagine I was like, oh yeah, there's something that exists that's all perfect, but it only exists in your head, right? Here seems like a better sort of trait. It actually exists outside of your head as in reality, okay? If that sounds right to you, that a perfect being should actually exist out in reality, not just in your head, then you should probably be on board with this premise right here, premise 3. Okay, so if premise 2, there's a much greater conceivable being because a being is greater if it exists. Premise 4 says, but that's a contradiction of 1. Okay, so why is this a contradiction? Well, the reason why is we're saying God's an all-perfect being. And then we're pretending that the greatest possible being exists only in the mind. So we're just pretending that God, we're referring to God here, only exists in the mind. We're pretending. But if we pretend, then we get this weird result where there's even a better being than apparently the most perfect being, because that better being would actually exist outside of our minds and in reality. Okay? But if that being is better than an all-perfect being, then God isn't all perfect according to this. Because if they're all perfect, there's nothing better than them, right? But if we follow this thought, there is something better. What's that something better? Well, the thing that actually exists out in reality, not just in our mind. So there's a contradiction here, okay? It's saying that you both have something that's an all-perfect being, and some other thing that's better than that all-perfect being. Like, imagine being better than perfect. That doesn't make any sense, okay? So when you have a contradiction, you gotta throw away one of the two things that's causing it, right? Either you throw away the fact that God's an all-perfect being, or you throw away 2 and 3 here. You throw away the idea that the greatest possible being exists only in the mind, okay? Now, like I said, we're just already assuming, for one, that when we talk about God, we're talking about an all-perfect being. We're not saying whether he exists or not. We're just saying that, well, if he did exist, it's an all-perfect being. Okay. So we can't really throw this away, because if we throw this away, then we're just not talking about God anymore. We're just talking about, well, not God, basically. Okay? We need to talk about this. That's what we're just talking on the course. We're just talking about an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being. Okay? So we can't throw this away. What are we stuck with? Well, we're stuck with throwing away 2 and 3. Namely, we have to throw away the idea that the greatest possible being exists only in the mind. Okay? So, if we throw these away, and God's an all-perfect being, and it's better to exist in reality than just in the mind, it seems actually that just God exists in reality. Because if God didn't exist in reality and was just in our mind, because God does exist in our mind, we can think about him, talk about him, right? Then there would have to be something greater than God. But we already said that we're already stipulating God's a perfect being. Whether he exists or not, we don't know, but we're just stipulating that. We're giving the theists a fair shot here, all right? If that's the case, then we're forced to conclude, just based off the concept of God, that God exists. Right? And that's what makes this argument so interesting, is that it just seems like from this idea that there's a perfect being, that we're forced to conclude it exists, right? It's a kind of, you might think, it's an argument much closer to like a mathematical kind of argument than the sorts of arguments we were looking at in the previous videos. So in the previous videos, we're looking at arguments where we talk about our experience of the world around us, right? So this is referring to, these are called a posteriori reasons, or the reasons from experience, okay? These, on the other hand, we don't even know anything about the world to determine whether God exists or not, right? We don't need to know anything about causation. We don't know anything about designers or the things around us. All we got is God being a perfect being and us realizing that existence is a kind of perfection, and God's all perfect and existence is perfection, and it's better to exist out in reality than in the mind, then you're forced to conclude God exists. So, that's the ontological argument for the existence of God.